What can happen in 18 minutes? A coffee break. A short walk. A quiet lunch at sea. On May 7, 1915, 18 minutes were enough to erase one of the most powerful ships in the world, and push America toward war. The ocean was calm that afternoon, far too calm for a world at war. This is not just a shipwreck story. This is the moment the modern world realized nowhere was safe anymore. On May 7, 1915, the proud British liner RMS Lusitania sliced through the cold waters off the southern coast of Ireland, her 4 towering funnels exhaling ribbons of smoke into a pale sky. She was elegance. She was speed. She was floating royalty. Nearly 2,000 souls were aboard. First-class elites walked polished decks in tailored coats. Children laughed near the railings. A violin played softly in the lounge. Crystal glasses clinked. Letters were being written. Tea was being poured. And beneath it all, there was confidence. Confidence that this ship, one of the fastest and most luxurious vessels ever built, was untouchable. But 700 feet below the rolling gray horizon, in the silent darkness of the Atlantic, something was watching. Inside the steel hull of the German submarine SMU-20, Captain Walter Schwieger stood in silence. The air around him smelled of oil, sweat, and metal. His crew had been at sea for weeks. They were exhausted. Tense. Hungry for targets. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. And Lusitania was sailing straight into it. The Lusitania was no ordinary passenger liner. She was a symbol of British supremacy at sea, built in 1906 to dominate the Atlantic crossing between Liverpool and New York. At her launch, she was the fastest ship in the world. She could outrun almost anything afloat. Passengers believed that speed was her shield. Newspapers had even published warnings from the German embassy in the United States, cautioning travelers that British ships entering war zones did so at their own risk. Most ignored it. Some laughed at it. After all, this was the Lusitania. Captain William Thomas Turner had received warnings of submarine activity. The Admiralty in United Kingdom had advised caution. Zigzag patterns. Extra lookouts. But the day was clear. The sea was smooth. And war, to many aboard, still felt distant. Even to the American passengers, citizens of the still neutral United States, the conflict seemed like a European tragedy unfolding far away. They were wrong. Terribly wrong. Inside U-20, tension was building. Through the periscope, Schwieger finally saw it. Smoke on the horizon. Then, masts. Then, 4 massive funnels. A giant. He recognized her almost instantly. This was no cargo vessel. This was a prize. The crew gathered quietly. The submarine adjusted its depth. Torpedoes were prepared. Calculations were made with cold precision. Distance. Speed. Angle. Wind. Time. Schwieger knew what this meant. He also knew what it might cause. Because Lusitania was rumored to carry civilians, possibly even Americans. But she was also suspected of carrying munitions. And under wartime orders, she was a legitimate target. Schwieger gave the command. 1 torpedo. Just 1. At 2:10 in the afternoon, passengers were finishing lunch. A young mother adjusted her daughter's hat near the rail. A businessman sealed an envelope. A steward polished silverware. Then, a violent jolt ripped through the ship. A deep metallic thud echoed through her hull. Some described it as a punch. Others as a slam. Below decks, plates shattered. Steam pipes burst. People were thrown to the floor. But what happened next, no one expected. A second explosion followed. Bigger. Deeper. More devastating. The ship shuddered violently as if something inside her had detonated. The power flickered. The deck tilted. Screams began. And within moments, the unsinkable confidence of the Lusitania turned into raw, uncontrollable terror. Water flooded in at an alarming rate. The second explosion had torn open compartments deep within the hull. Later, survivors would argue endlessly about its cause. Was it coal dust? Was it hidden ammunition? Was it structural failure? But in that moment, the cause didn't matter. The ship was dying. Fast. Captain Turner rushed to the bridge. Orders were shouted. Engines reversed. Distress signals sent. But the Lusitania began listing sharply to starboard. So sharply that lifeboats on one side became nearly impossible to launch. Crew members struggled with ropes. Passengers panicked. Some lifeboats crashed into the hull. Others spilled their occupants into the freezing Atlantic. The tilt grew worse. People slid across wet decks. Children were separated from parents. The orchestra reportedly tried to play. And beneath the surface, U-20 watched. That's all it took. 18 minutes from impact to disappearance. The massive liner, once the pride of the Atlantic, dipped her bow into the sea. Her stern rose. Propellers spinning uselessly in the air. And then, she was gone. Leaving behind debris. Screams. And nearly 1,200 dead. Many trapped inside. Many never recovered. The Atlantic swallowed them in silence. And that was only the beginning. Because what happened next would ripple across the world and push nations toward war. For a few seconds after the second explosion, there was a silence so unnatural it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Then came the screaming. Men shouted orders that no one could hear. Women clutched children to their chests. Dishes shattered. Steam roared from ruptured pipes. The proud decks of the RMS Lusitania, once polished and orderly, turned into a slanted battlefield of fear. The list to starboard grew worse by the second. Captain William Thomas Turner stood on the bridge, stunned by the speed of the damage. He had commanded ships for decades. He had sailed through storms that split masts and froze rigging solid. But this was different. This ship was not supposed to die like this. He ordered the helm hard to port, trying to beach her toward the Irish coast. He ordered lifeboats lowered. But physics had already taken control. Because of the severe tilt, the lifeboats on the port side hung high above the water, useless. On the starboard side, they swung dangerously against the hull. Crew members struggled to steady them. Passengers surged forward. And panic became contagious. In first class, a young American mother named Eliza Thornton, traveling back to New York with her 6-year-old daughter, felt the deck shift violently beneath her feet. She didn't understand at first. It must have been a mechanical failure. A collision. Something temporary. Then she saw the water rushing across the lower promenade deck. Her daughter asked, "Mama, are we sinking?" Eliza couldn't answer. She grabbed her child's hand and ran toward the lifeboats. Around her, evening gowns dragged across wet planks. Top hats rolled like abandoned toys. A man with blood running down his forehead tried to lift his wife over the railing. The ship tilted further. Now the angle was so sharp people had to cling to railings just to remain standing. In steerage, the nightmare was worse. Families traveling in third class, many emigrants chasing new lives, struggled through narrow corridors already flooding. Some were trapped behind jammed doors. Water poured in relentlessly. Lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed entire sections of the ship. Some never even made it above deck. Beneath the waves, inside SMU-20, Captain Walter Schwieger watched through his periscope. He had expected damage. He had not expected this. The second explosion puzzled him. He would later write in his war diary that the detonation seemed unusually heavy. His crew remained silent. They could hear distant rumbling even through the submarine's hull. Schwieger knew immediately, this sinking would not go unnoticed. There were Americans aboard. And America was still neutral. The decision he had just made would echo far beyond this gray stretch of sea. But the war did not pause for regret. He ordered the submarine to withdraw. Above him, nearly 2,000 people were fighting for their lives. Back on deck, lifeboats launched unevenly. One boat lowered too quickly and smashed into the water, throwing passengers out like dolls. Another tipped as terrified men leapt into it without waiting for orders. Some boats drifted away half-empty. Others overturned entirely. People jumped into the sea to avoid being sucked down. The water was freezing, barely above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Shock hit instantly. Heavy coats dragged people under. Children slipped from their parents' grasp. The bow of the Lusitania plunged deeper. Furniture, deck chairs, and debris slid violently toward the front of the ship. A priest gave last rites to anyone within earshot. Some passengers knelt and prayed. Others stared in disbelief. It had been less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes. At approximately 2:28 p.m., the end came. The stern rose high into the air, towering above the ocean like a wounded beast making one final stand. For a heartbeat, the massive propellers spun uselessly against the sky. Then gravity won. The ship slipped beneath the surface. The ocean rushed in. A thunderous roar echoed as air escaped from the hull. And then, silence. The great liner was gone. What remained was chaos. Hundreds of people thrashed in the water. Screams pierced the cold air. Lifeboats circled desperately, pulling survivors aboard. Some rescuers had to choose whom to save. A child or an injured man. A woman struggling weakly or a body already still. Time was merciless. Within minutes, hypothermia began stealing strength. Arms stopped moving. Voices faded. The Atlantic claimed them one by one. Out of nearly 1,960 aboard, 1,198 would die. Among them, 128 Americans. Many bodies were never recovered. The sea kept its secrets. From the shores near Queenstown, today known as Cove, Ireland, fishermen and villagers saw smoke on the horizon. Then lifeboats. Then wreckage drifting inward. Rescue vessels rushed out. But they were too late to prevent the tragedy. They could only gather the broken pieces. And the bodies. Rows of them were later laid out in temporary morgues. Families walked between sheets, searching for faces they loved. Some found them. Many did not. News traveled fast. Headlines exploded across London. Across New York. Across Washington. British liner sunk. Americans dead. Women and children lost. In the still neutral United States, outrage surged. Newspapers called it barbaric. Politicians demanded answers. Germany defended the attack, claiming the ship carried contraband ammunition destined for Britain, a legitimate military target. Britain denied it. The truth would become tangled in propaganda, secrecy, and decades of argument. But one thing was undeniable. Public opinion had shifted. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania did not immediately bring America into the war. But it planted a seed. A seed of anger. A seed of distrust. A seed that would grow. Weeks later, deep underwater, the wreck of Lusitania settled on the seabed off Ireland's coast. Twisted. Broken. Silent. Inside her hull lay dining rooms once filled with laughter. Cabins where letters were never finished. Toys still clutched in small hands. The Atlantic currents moved gently through shattered windows. As if nothing had happened. But the world had changed. And the war was only getting started. By nightfall on May 7, 1915, the cold Atlantic had grown quiet again, but the silence was deceptive, because across oceans and continents a storm was gathering that no one could see yet, and it began with ink splashing onto paper in newsrooms from London to New York. In the still neutral United States, telegraph wires hummed through the evening, carrying fragments of horror: liner torpedoed. Americans missing. Hundreds feared dead, and in crowded editorial rooms men in suspenders shouted for confirmation while printers prepared special editions that would hit the streets before dawn. By sunrise, the name RMS Lusitania was on every front page in America. New York City awoke to chaos, as newsboys ran through the streets waving papers overhead and shouting headlines at the top of their lungs, their voices cracking as they repeated the word that now burned into public consciousness: torpedoed. Families gathered around breakfast tables in stunned silence, reading the names of the missing, scanning passenger lists printed in narrow columns, praying they would not recognize a familiar name, praying that a son, a sister, a business partner had somehow survived. And then the number emerged. 1,198 dead. 128 Americans among them. The outrage ignited instantly. Church bells tolled. Public meetings were called. Speakers climbed onto wooden platforms in city squares and demanded action. Cartoonists drew savage images of German submarines as sea monsters devouring innocent mothers and children. The word murder began appearing in headlines. Across the Atlantic, in the war offices of United Kingdom, officials understood immediately what this meant, because beyond the tragedy itself there was something else: opportunity. British propaganda machines accelerated overnight, distributing posters, pamphlets, and photographs of drowned children to American audiences, knowing that sympathy might tip the balance of history. But in Berlin, the reaction was defensive and rigid. The government of Germany insisted that the sinking was justified, that Lusitania had been carrying rifle cartridges and munitions destined for the British war effort, that she was not merely a passenger liner but a disguised auxiliary cruiser transporting contraband. And indeed, hidden deep in her manifest were thousands of cases of ammunition. The debate exploded. Was she an innocent civilian ship? Or a legitimate military target hiding behind luxury and civilian lives? The truth became murky, tangled in wartime secrecy and strategic necessity. Inside the White House, President Woodrow Wilson sat at his desk long into the night, the weight of the crisis pressing down on him like the Atlantic itself. Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of the European war, and many Americans still wanted neutrality, still believed that the conflict across the ocean was not their fight, but now blood had been spilled, American blood. And the pressure to respond was immense. Advisors argued in tense whispers behind closed doors. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others warned that rushing into war could tear the nation apart. German-American citizens feared backlash. Isolationists pleaded for restraint. Wall Street worried about markets. Mothers feared for their sons. Wilson chose words carefully. He drafted a stern diplomatic note to Germany, condemning the attack and demanding assurances that civilian ships would not be targeted again, but he stopped short of declaring war. He believed that America must be too proud to fight, at least for now. But beneath the calm language of diplomacy, anger simmered. Across the ocean, the commander of the submarine, Walter Schwieger, continued his patrols, his war diary reflecting both professional detachment and a flicker of unease, because he knew the scale of what had happened, and he knew that this single torpedo might prove more powerful than an entire fleet. Back in Ireland, funerals began. Coffins lined the streets of Queenstown. Priests spoke over rows of mourners dressed in black. Some graves were marked only with numbers. Some families buried empty coffins, because the sea had not returned their loved ones. Survivors carried memories that would haunt them forever. A father who had lifted his child into a lifeboat only to lose her grip at the last second. A steward who watched corridors flood faster than he could shout warnings. A young woman who floated for hours clutching wreckage, listening as voices around her gradually went silent. They would replay those 18 minutes in their minds for decades. 18 minutes that reshaped the 20th century. In Washington, tension did not fade, it deepened. Germany eventually issued what became known as the Arabic Pledge, promising to limit attacks on passenger vessels, but distrust lingered, because once the ocean has swallowed innocence, it does not easily return faith. The Lusitania's sinking did not bring America into the war immediately, but it changed the emotional climate forever. It turned distant headlines into personal grief. It made submarine warfare a household word. It forced Americans to confront a brutal new reality of modern war, a war without warning, without chivalry, without mercy. And beneath the waves, the wreck rested in darkness, a steel tomb slowly claimed by corrosion and currents, while on the surface politics, propaganda, and destiny moved like gathering thunderclouds. Because 2 years later, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and American ships were again sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, the memory of Lusitania would surge back into speeches, into newspapers, into the conscience of a nation. And when the United States finally declared war in 1917, many would look back to that May afternoon off the Irish coast and say, that was the moment the tide began to turn. But history is never simple. Questions remained. What exactly caused the second explosion? Was there more ammunition aboard than Britain admitted? Was Lusitania sacrificed as bait to draw America into war? Conspiracy theories would echo for generations. Divers would later descend to the wreck, discovering twisted metal and scattered artifacts, each discovery reigniting debate and mystery. And so the story did not end with the sinking. It evolved. It lingered. It became legend. A legend born in smoke and fire and 18 merciless minutes. In the weeks after the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, the grief had barely settled before another force began to rise from the wreckage: suspicion. Because tragedy explains loss, but mystery keeps it alive. Very quickly, whispers began circulating through diplomatic circles, naval offices, and smoky editorial rooms. What caused the second explosion? Survivors had described it clearly. First, the torpedo impact, a sharp metallic blow against the hull, and then, seconds later, a deeper, more violent detonation from within the ship itself. That second blast was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Without it, Lusitania might have stayed afloat longer. Without it, lifeboats might have launched properly. Without it, hundreds might have lived. So what was it? Germany insisted the answer was simple. The ship, they claimed, was carrying munitions. And they were not entirely wrong. Shipping manifests later confirmed that Lusitania was transporting rifle cartridges, shell casings, and other war supplies destined for Britain. Not bombs. Not high explosives. But ammunition nonetheless. The British government downplayed it immediately. Yes, there were cartridges aboard. Yes, they were legal under maritime law. But they were small arms ammunition, safely stored, incapable of causing such a devastating internal blast. Or were they? The debate ignited fiercely. In Washington, critics demanded transparency. In London, officials guarded information carefully. And somewhere beneath the Atlantic, the twisted steel hull kept its silence. Years passed. Decades passed. Divers would eventually descend to the wreck, discovering scattered ammunition cases still resting among debris, but no definitive proof of massive hidden explosives. Yet the mystery refused to die. Some theorized that coal dust in the ship's bunkers had ignited after the torpedo strike, triggering a secondary explosion. Others suggested structural collapse inside the boiler rooms. A few went further, claiming Lusitania had been deliberately allowed to sail without proper escort, used as bait to provoke outrage in the still neutral United States. Was that possible? In 1915, British intelligence had indeed intercepted German naval communications. They knew submarines were active in the area. But convoy systems had not yet become standard practice. And Lusitania, famous for her speed, was believed capable of outrunning a submarine. That confidence would prove fatal. Captain William Thomas Turner later faced intense scrutiny. Some accused him of failing to zigzag sufficiently. Others argued he had followed Admiralty instructions exactly as given. He carried the burden of that day for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the commander of the attacking submarine, Walter Schwieger, became both villain and hero depending on which side of the ocean one stood. In Germany, he was praised for striking a blow against Britain's supply lines. In Britain and America, he was portrayed as the face of ruthless submarine warfare. But even he admitted surprise at how quickly the ship sank. He had expected damage. He had not expected annihilation in 18 minutes. And so the second explosion remained the ghost inside the story, the unseen force that magnified tragedy. If the torpedo tore open the hull, propaganda tore open the world. Posters appeared across Britain showing drowning mothers and lifeless children with captions that read, "Remember Lusitania." In America, political speeches referenced the sinking again and again. Each repetition carved the memory deeper into public consciousness. It became more than a disaster. It became a symbol. A symbol of vulnerability. A symbol of modern warfare's cruelty. A symbol of the blurred line between civilian and combatant. And yet, America still did not enter the war. Not yet. President Wilson continued walking a diplomatic tightrope. He demanded assurances from Germany. Germany temporarily moderated submarine tactics. For a moment, it seemed the crisis might fade into history as a terrible but contained event. But war has momentum. And momentum does not stop easily. In early 1917, Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting all ships, neutral or not, within designated war zones. The gamble was bold. Germany believed it could starve Britain into surrender before America could mobilize. It was a calculation of time versus outrage. And when American ships began sinking again, the memory of Lusitania surged back with unstoppable force. The image of that great liner disappearing beneath the waves became a rallying cry. Newspapers reprinted photographs from 1915. Speakers invoked the names of the dead. The Atlantic was no longer distant. It was personal. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. 2 years after the torpedo strike. 2 years after 18 minutes changed history. Lusitania was not the sole cause of America's entry into World War I. But she was the spark that had smoldered beneath the surface. A warning ignored. A wound remembered. A symbol impossible to erase. Today, the wreck of the RMS Lusitania lies on her starboard side nearly 300 feet below the surface off the Irish coast. Her once grand decks are collapsed. Her funnels gone. Her hull fractured. Artifacts rest in darkness. Porcelain fragments, shoes, twisted railings. Time has softened the steel. But it has not softened the story. Divers who descend describe an eerie stillness. A feeling that the ocean itself remembers. Because shipwrecks are not just metal and rust. They are frozen moments. Moments when laughter turned to screams. When certainty turned to chaos. When a single torpedo shifted the course of nations. History often changes slowly, through treaties, elections, negotiations. But sometimes, it changes in an instant. In a flash of fire beneath the waterline. In a second explosion no one fully understands. In 18 merciless minutes. The Lusitania sailed as a symbol of confidence. She sank as a symbol of consequence. And in her wake, the world moved closer to total war. The ocean closed above her. But the ripples reached every shore. More than a century has passed since the afternoon the RMS Lusitania slipped beneath the Atlantic, yet the ocean above her wreck still looks deceptively calm, as if nothing extraordinary ever happened there, as if nearly 1,200 lives were not swallowed in less than the length of a school lunch break. The water moves gently. Fishing boats pass overhead. Sunlight scatters across the surface. And 300 feet below, in dim blue silence, steel bones rest where a floating palace once carried laughter, ambition, romance, and dreams of new beginnings. Imagine descending slowly through that cold water. Imagine the light fading. Imagine the outline of the hull emerging like a ghost from another century. There is no music down there. No headlines. No politics. Only quiet. And in that quiet lies the weight of 18 minutes that altered history. Because the story of Lusitania is not only about a torpedo. It is about confidence. It is about miscalculation. It is about how technology can outpace morality. It is about how civilians become casualties when war expands beyond battlefields. On that May afternoon in 1915, passengers believed they were crossing an ocean. They did not know they were crossing a fault line in world history. A mother adjusting her daughter's hat did not know she stood at the edge of geopolitics. A captain scanning the horizon did not know his decisions would be dissected for generations. A submarine commander peering through a periscope did not know that a single command would ripple into global consequence. History rarely announces itself when it changes. It whispers first. A diplomatic warning printed in a newspaper. A rumor of submarines offshore. A quiet calculation inside a steel hull beneath the waves. And then, impact. The second explosion remains the haunting heartbeat of this story. That deeper blast. That violent internal rupture. The moment when survival time collapsed from possibility to impossibility. Without it, perhaps the ship floats longer. Without it, lifeboats launch evenly. Without it, outrage cools. Without it, history bends slightly differently. But it happened. And because it happened, the world shifted. When the United States eventually entered the war in 1917, it did so for many reasons: unrestricted submarine warfare, intercepted telegrams, economic ties. Yet the memory of Lusitania stood in the background like a shadow that refused to fade. It had personalized the war. It had given it faces. Names. Funerals. It had transformed distant artillery into something intimate. And once war becomes personal, neutrality becomes fragile. Meanwhile, the empire that launched the torpedo, Germany, would itself collapse by 1918 under the crushing weight of global conflict, revolution, and exhaustion. Millions would die before the war finally ended. Borders would be redrawn. New resentments would be born. Seeds of another world war would be planted in the ashes. All connected, in part, to decisions made in tension-filled rooms and steel submarines years earlier. And what of the individuals? Captain William Thomas Turner lived with scrutiny and suspicion long after the sea closed over his ship. Commander Walter Schwieger would continue his naval career, only to be lost at sea himself in 1917 when his own submarine struck a mine. The hunter swallowed by the same indifferent ocean. History has a way of completing its circles. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Lusitania is not political. It is human. It is the reminder that progress, faster ships, deadlier submarines, industrial-scale warfare, does not guarantee wisdom. In 1915, the world believed it was modern, civilized, advanced. And yet within 18 minutes, that illusion fractured like glass under pressure. Today, when we look back at the wreck resting silently off the Irish coast, we are not just looking at corroded steel. We are looking at a warning. A reminder that pride can underestimate danger. That war expands in ways leaders cannot fully control. That civilian lives are always the most fragile currency in geopolitical games. The ocean keeps many secrets. But it does not erase consequence. Above the wreck, waves continue their endless rhythm. Storms come and go. Generations rise and fall. Yet the story remains. A luxury liner. A periscope. One torpedo. A second explosion. 18 minutes. And a world pushed closer to total war. If you listen carefully, beyond the noise of modern life, beyond politics, beyond history books, you can almost hear it. Not the explosion. Not the screaming. But the silence that followed. The silence of a vanished ship. The silence of unfinished conversations. The silence of futures that never unfolded. And perhaps that is why Lusitania still matters. Because it reminds us how quickly certainty can sink. How suddenly calm seas can turn fatal. How a single decision, made in seconds, can echo for generations. The Atlantic looks peaceful. It always does. Until it isn't. Have you heard about this tragedy? Please share in the comments.